Hi, this is Glenn Loury, The Glenn Show, bloggingheads.tv and patreon.com/Glenn Show. Thanks for your attention. Just want to make a brief announcement here about the question and answer process that John McWhorter and I are engaging in here at The Glenn Show. Once a month, we gather the questions that patrons have submitted and offer our responses to them. And we're going to be doing that again here in the month of March on Monday of next week, the 15th. And want to encourage you to, if you are a patron at the $10 tier, look at the top of the posts and see where you can submit a question. If you're a patron at the $5 tier, we welcome you to enjoy the responses that John and I will offer to these questions. And our responses will go up shortly after we record them on Monday of next week. So $10 tier patrons, we encourage you to submit your questions. The answers, the responses will be accessible to $5 and $10 tier supporters of our show. Thanks very much. Hey, Daniel, how you doing?
Hi, Glenn. I'm doing well. Thanks for having me back.
I'm so glad. I'm grateful to you. This is Glenn Loury, The Glenn Show, bloggingheads.tv and patreon.com/Glenn Show. Glenn Loury and I'm with Daniel Bessner, he teaches at the Henry Jackson School of International Studies at the University of Washington. And those who follow The Glenn Show know that Daniel has appeared here in the past. In fact, on 3 separate occasions in the past, engaging in discussions with me about my intellectual origins. And he's an intellectual historian, Daniel is. And parts 1, 2, and 3 are in the archive. This is part 4. I expect we conclude the series here. Born in Chicago, educated at Northwestern University, trained at MIT, a Reagan conservative at one point in time, then a very broke with the right kind of disgruntled guy. And we're at part 4, so I'm going to turn it over to Daniel. Thanks.
Sure. Oh, yeah. No, of course, Glenn. It's been a real pleasure, a real highlight of my intellectual career so far, honestly. So basically, last time we got up to 2012. And so we're entering what I would say is the more recent period of Glenn Loury's intellectual development, a period that has actually been chronicled on Blogging Heads itself, which I'm hoping someday someone will make transcripts of these conversations and deposit them in some sort of archive, because they're really useful historical material. But the first thing that I want to talk with and sort of talk about your response to these things, but what I want to try to do is do it in sort of your larger intellectual framework, because people might have heard what you think of BLM or wokeness, but what I'm trying to do here is have you reflect on how these recent trends might fit into your larger intellectual trajectory, given what we've talked about in the past. So I was thinking that we would start in 2014 and the rise of Black Lives Matter, which is a movement that you've criticized, I think, pretty significantly on this podcast. But what I would like to do is have you reflect on what was your initial response to the first BLM protests. In particular, how do you place them within your larger understanding of Black American history, in particular your own encounter with the Black community, trying to reflect on why you've adopted quite a critical stance toward BLM and where you see the movement going wrong, and how your history informs your understanding of Black Lives Matter.
God, you put Black Lives Matter right at the center of it. If I had known that, I might have canceled the interview. Just kidding. Such a big panoramic question. I should have come to expect that from you, Daniel, but I know there'll be iterations here, so we'll have a time. I mean, you can't just answer in one gulp to something like that.
Of course not.
I want to start anecdotally, which I think can also be very powerful. And thank you for those kind words about the value of what we've been doing here at the Glenn Show. I mean, I'm very honored to have you say that, because you're a serious scholar, etc. But enough. I have a friend. His name is Christopher Lydon. Lydon, and he's a radio guy and a podcast guy who talks about ideas and culture and stuff. He was based in Boston. I assume he's still in Boston. I've known him for a long time, since the early 80s. And he did a PBS show for a long time, a radio show where he would interview people. And Chris is a very decent guy, very thoughtful guy. He belonged to a Black Baptist church, 12 Baptist in Boston. Back in the day when I was a Christian, we would commiserate around some of those issues as well as around the intellectual scene. Liberal Democrat for sure, but thoughtful. Oh, but you see, thoughtful. And I can remember, I'm not sure exactly what the year is. I want to say it's right after Trayvon Martin, because that's when I think things really get going. I think it's 2012 or something like that. And he's all excited. He's so excited about this phenomenon, about this movement. And he had a show where he asked me to come and participate in the studio, which I did do. And there was a very fine young scholar, African-American from Tufts University, a historian, who was also a part of the show. And there were callers, and we did the show. And they were all excited. This is a movement. This is a movement. And gosh, but I wasn't feeling it. I wasn't feeling it as this revolutionary thing. Okay, so these queer Black women, I mean, this was the tone of the talk, have launched something, and this is a new generation. But it's a civil rights movement. It's going right after oppression, and I didn't really feel it on both sides. Neither did I feel that as horrible as what happened to young Trayvon Martin in Sanford, Florida. He lost his life. And that's a whole rabbit hole that I don't want to go down right now. What actually happened to Trayvon Martin? George Zimmerman, was acquitted? Blah, blah, blah. We could spend a whole thing talking about that. I'll bracket that. I certainly did not have any perspective on what had happened to Trayvon Martin at the time. I just took it as given that he was gunned down by George Zimmerman in some kind of inappropriate way. And I just want to bracket that. I still wasn't feeling it. I wasn't feeling movement at all. So on that side, the offense, the nature of the offense, Black men being gunned down, I was skeptical about that as something that you would put on a par with what I actually experienced as a young person in the 1950s and especially in the 1960s of a movement. So now a movement was being started, and there's something ephemeral, something insubstantial about it, something faddish, something a little bit of a mass kind of mentality that I was skeptical about. I didn't necessarily see the movement. I cringed when Obama said if I had a son, he'd look like Trayvon. When Obama was managing and navigating the very difficult, problem of how to lead the country and speak for the country at this moment of crisis, I cringed a little bit because I wasn't quite buying the narrative. The narrative was that we're at a latter day moment of racial domination, which is finally being called to account by a mobilization from the bottom of the people's voice. And I didn't buy that. So I'm in the studio there with Chris and with the young scholar, whose name I don't recall, unfortunately, from Tufts, who's a fine historian. And and they're all effervescent. They're all, we're present at the creation is kind of what the feeling was. And I just, I wasn't buying it. And maybe it's an echo of what happened in 2008 with the rise of Barack Hussein Obama, where there was, and Chris and I had a thing about that too, as it happens. Maybe that's the reason I'm remembering it in this way. because these are the feelings that I was having as I was moving away from the left, away from a sense of defining myself in terms of, opposition to racism, to, because I was into the incarceration issue, and and I wrote and I spoke about that, but I don't want to lose the train of my thought. I'm talking about Chris Lighton, and I'm talking about that moment in that studio with the Trayvon Martin incident and the birth of Black Lives Matter. And I was remembering back to 2008. Our time had come. We are the ones that we've been waiting for, hope and change. And there was all of that Obama mania, which I thought a little bit skeptical about, although eventually I got on the bandwagon for Obama. But it was a kind of politics. I wasn't sure that it was touching the ground. So I say on both sides. So neither did I feel the sense of the kind of profound political galvanization that people asserted was true. I didn't feel it. Neither was I attracted by the movement. I wasn't particularly attracted by the movement. And I don't think there's any way that I can say that that's going to be pretty or that's going to be nice. I worry that I'll sound, so culturally retrograde when I say that the constellation of forces. Now, I'm not just talking about sex. I know that's what people think I'm talking about. They think I'm talking about sexual identity. That's part of it. I'm not going to deny that that's part of it. They are against capitalism. Okay, we had a long conversation about that. Okay, they don't particularly love America. I know that you and I, Daniel, don't necessarily agree on all the particulars of nationalism and whatnot, but I'm just telling you how I received them. There's a generational thing. I'm in my 70s. What do you want me to do? These are kids, snot-nosed kids, if you want to get me, in an unguarded moment. So it's like, this is not your daddy's civil rights movement. That was spoken during some of the, because there's this documentary film about Michael Brown that the Shelby and Eli Steele have made. They have a lot of film in there, and one of the scenes is a young fella who is outraged about the Michael Brown situation, speaking to an audience. This is not, in other words, don't expect decorum from us. Don't expect reverence from us. Don't expect solemnity from us. Don't expect any kind of religiosity from us. There isn't going to be any kumbaya here. We'll burn this motherfucker down if we need to. That was the spirit. It was not an appeal to any transcendent, cooperative national enterprise. It was it was specifically juxtaposed to your country, your statues, your canon, your narrative. It took Black people out of, they're against the nuclear family. Of course, they've cleansed the website now. So it's only the Sean Hannitys and the Tucker Carlsons who will tell us that Black Lives Matter initially had, kind of what are our principles up there, among which were we against the nuclear family. It's full of all kind of what I think of in my 70s as postmodern nostrums and, cliches, really. I mean, the critical race theoretic, the intersectionality kind of talk, So I was not feeling it. They weren't attractive to me. They didn't represent what I wanted to affirm. And I didn't see the moment as one of the kind of, uh, you know, we need a movement to protect Black people from the cops. I think that's absurd. I mean, we could go into that, but anyway,
So
I'm rambling on. I'm rambling on. I apologize.
no, not at all. So there's an affectual dimension, which is just a generation gap in some sense, literally the clothing and the style of rhetoric. There sounds like you think there was an empirical problem as well, that the claims didn't reflect empirical reality in some sense. Am I getting that correct?
Well, that is correct. I don't think the claims reflect empirical reality. I think they're sensationalized and opportunistically seized upon. That's why I say movement, really? A movement against police brutality? Come on, give me a break. That's what I think, really. I mean, a country of 300 million people, a handful of incidents. I'm not saying there's nothing to talk about, but I'm saying, really? Michael Brown is Emmett Till? You're not serious. That's not, neither is that history, nor is it politics.
And then another thing that I'm hearing, and I might want to dig down on this one a bit more, is that it seemed like offense might not be the right word, but what you found a bit distasteful was the rejection of what I would refer to as a historian of the Cold War liberal project to present the United States as some sort of melting pot that transcends ethnic identity, transcends racial, gender, sexual identity, so that everyone becomes an American. Is that also correct? That you found
that was not what I had in mind as I spoke, but it is correct.
Right.
I mean, I only touched on that briefly when I said they don't love America or whatever words I said. And I definitely chafe at the alienation from the national project, which I take to be a defining characteristic of the movement. That's not just a straight ahead narrative about kumbaya, we're going to all melt together and get along. I think that's a very complicated set of issues about identity, assimilation, and whatnot. But yes, I'm much friendlier to the racially transcending, seeing African American as not an indigestible kind of more like an ethnic group that the meaning of the Blackness as a distinctive characteristic is malleable and it can evolve over time. And you know, obviously that's a big subject, and we could talk about it. I'm not giving it justice at all here.
So just a quick comment that I want to make. It's interesting because I think you have a very complex relationship with what might be termed Afro-pessimism, because in an earlier conversation, you said that like there was something right about Malcolm X, that no one's going to help you and you've got to do it yourself. But at the same time, right now, you're saying that Afro-pessimism is unwarranted when we're talking about sort of this racially transcendent image utopia of the United States.
No, I think you put your finger on something that's very profound. I really do. As it happens, it's come up in my own public intellectual practice recently, because I've developed a relationship with Robert Woodson's Woodson Center in Washington, and 1776 Unites, which is a project that they've launched. And I could talk about that a lot, but the main thing that I want to get across is it's Black empowerment. It's a kind of self-help in the spirit of Booker T. Washington, which presupposes a kind of substantiality to race and racial identity, Black community. Now, Woodson is not only Blacks. I mean, he has relationships and he works with community organizations across the color line. But the history, animus, and spirit of it is very much a Black empowerment, not Malcolm X, Nation of Islam, but Booker T. Washington-esque. And I sit on the kind of council of, giving advice to Bob about the thing that he's doing, and I put my finger on this very thing that you're talking about, which is that on the one hand, we want to affirm a kind of colorblind philosophy. I'm not saying that in a stick-figured way. I'm not being simple-minded about it, but I'm saying about, we want to look beyond race. We want to talk about the American people and not just about black. We don't want to pit the groups against each other, etc. On the other hand, we're rooted in race.
Right.
We are a racial phenomenon. Our identities are why we're here. We want to uplift our people. So when we use that first person plural, that's an ambiguous antecedent. Our people refers to multiple collectivities. And it's a very difficult problem. And I'm not sure that I have my hands on it, really. I think that I may be in danger of getting into a kind of contradiction, with an internal contradiction in my own political practice. Because I am, at some level, you call it Afro-pessimism. I want to say I'm seizing the existential imperative of self-determination. That doesn't necessarily make me pessimistic. On the other hand, whatever it is, if it's Colin Kaepernick, what I want to say is, man, don't use the national anthem as the place to express your disaffection, because we need all the people. I'm not against Colin. If he wants to protest, he can protest. What I'm against is pitting this symbol of the country against the aspiration for African Americans not to be killed by police. That, I think, is a mistake, or at least it's not a way that I want to go. So, I want to frame the police brutality problem in a generic way. I don't want to racialize it, in part because I don't want to racialize the discussion of crime and punishment more broadly, since that's got two sides to it. That's a difficult conversation if you want to go down the road of racializing, who gets violated, who gets offended against in this country, who does the offending. I'm not sure we want to keep a racial tabulation on that kind of thing. You can't necessarily confine it just to talking about how police interact with unarmed citizens. But in any case, the point I'm making is that on the one hand, I do want to embrace a kind of Black agency informed by our history and culture being a reference to African American experience. But I also want to place the social problematic within a framework of a kind of nationalist sensibility. It's the American project. In other words, there is no world court at which the claims of African Americans are going to be resolved. It's not going to be the United Nations that does it. It's going to be the American polity, the American organic political mechanism. And I think that we could go into reparation, for example, but I have a very similar concern. It's the commodification of African America's claims within the larger American framework that I worry about, the transactional nature of formal reparation acknowledgement. I'm not just talking about a stipulation that an act of Congress might make. I'm talking about hundreds of billions or trillions of dollars of federal money programmatically administered, institutionally structured in the country. This is Social Security magnitude public agency on behalf of a racial project. I think that's a deep, deep, deep mistake for the country and for, quote unquote, my people, meaning Black people. And we could go into that, but the point I'm trying to draw on now, I think I've probably made my point, which is that on the one hand, I want Black people to rise up and seize responsibility for our lives. On the other hand, I don't want Black people to set ourselves off apart from the rest of the American polity and build our politics around that kind of oppositional framing. And that's a subtle. I'm not sure it's contradictory, but I'm not sure it's not.
It's interesting. It reminds me a lot of Clarence Thomas's philosophy, which I think emerges from the exact same place in a sense. I just have a quick question then about strategy. Because in some level, this is a question of strategy. I think you and BLM protesters might share similar goals. Police don't shoot Black people, or police don't shoot anyone, as the case may be. But in the United States, just as our system is organized, as the founders would say, the capital I interests, i.e. organized lobbying groups, highly motivated, small, determined, and well-defined groups often have a better sense or a better ability to make policy changes and people pointing towards, utopian isn't the right word, but some sort of color-blind world. So how do you address that question of strategy? Because isn't it just the nature of the American political system that groups need to mobilize and identify in a particular way and then promote their interests by defining themselves as a unique group with its own interests?
Yeah. I mean, you're reminding me of my friend Stephen Tellis, the political scientist who talks this way, but I'm sure any good political scientist would be talking this way. I mean, if I complain about the Democratic Party's policies on this or that issue, not necessarily reflecting the interests of African Americans, and yet African Americans are loyal constituents of the party, I will be reminded by, if not Steve, then somebody else, that it's a party after all. It's a coalition, and there's a lot of log rolling that's going on in internal, and if you want the movement to succeed, in this case, the progressive political movement embodied in the Democratic Party, you hold your nose or bite your tongue or whatever, and you allow for various kinds of accommodations to be made. It's you can't expect them to hit right on 100% solidly on what it is that you would like them to do. That's one kind of observation about strategy. But yeah.
Well, think about the Jews in AIPAC and the Jews in Israel, right? I mean, they've joined with Christian evangelicals, but going back to the late 19th century, ethnic groups have always organized to promote ethnic interests. Now, African Americans, I think, occupy a unique place in U.S. history, and it's not quite the same thing as saying Jewish immigrants from Eastern Europe.
My question is, are they? I mean, maybe the battlefield on which I want to die here is: are they African American interests?
Mm. Well, if you don't think
because they could well be something completely different. They could be the interest of a certain class and a certain sensibility that seizes on the opportunity afforded here. I'm not going to go into a George Soros conspiracy argument right now, but even by telling you that I'm not going to go there, you get the idea of what I'm talking about. And I just interviewed Michael Fortner, a political scientist at the City University of New York, who writes a book. His book, The Silent Black Majority, is an interesting book about local community attitudes toward crime and victimization and drug trafficking, and how it is that grassroots African-American ministers and politicians, community leaders actually got behind the Rockefeller drug law enactment in the state of New York, going back to the war on drugs, even before Ronald Reagan, and were very punitive in their desire to see drug trafficking extirpated and whatnot, and that voice within the Black community was interesting. It wasn't a one-dimensional voice. Of course, they sympathized with a lot of the young kids who were getting rousted by the cops. They were their kids. They didn't like police brutality any more than anybody else liked it. But they also knew that, if there's open air drug trafficking going on the corner, that's bad for the kids. And they knew that while the cops might be SOBs, you sure hope they show up when you need them, kind of thing like that. So that was, the quote unquote Black community's interest. But if you had asked an political activist on the radical left what their interests were, they would have said something different. So I don't know whether or not, for example, the movement to get reformed DAs elected at the local level who will decarcerate, who will stop arresting or charging for minor property offenses, who will urge the granting of no bail or low cash bail so that people would not be detained prior to trial. There's the argument for it, of course, is mass incarceration and the racialized character of mass incarceration. The argument against it might be carjackings and homicides going up in my community. And I don't know that there is a one answer to the question of what are the interests of the Black community, and therefore I don't necessarily feel that what Black Lives Matter are doing are rightly understood advancing the interests of the African American community. And I suppose if I thought that they were, I would look more kindly upon them.
Right. No, that makes a lot of sense. And of course, the answer is just Marxism. So we've actually got that one in total redistribution.
Okay, I'm going to just let that go.
Maybe something that emerges from this, which is a bit more general and maybe a bit more intellectual, but I think it's been very much in your wheelhouse recently, which is a criticism of wokeness, or so-called wokeness or woke discourse. So this is, of course, something that everyone listening to this probably knows about, has really exploded, particularly in elite academic circles in the last 5-6 years, even though there's been percolations of it for 50 years, if not longer, emerging from the 60s, particularly late 68. And I would just like to hear, what do you find problematic or offensive about wokeness as sort of a way of approaching the world? What is this intellectual disposition that doesn't work for you?
Tell me what you mean by wokeness, just briefly.
Sort of, I would say, like racial justice discourse, like attributing everything to like an identitarian politics that you find problematic. Probably that's the best way to do it. I think wokeness is often used to basically talk about identitarian politics. And so in academic circles, what do you find problematic about it? And it's related to questions of free speech. I think I would hope to talk about, and also cancel culture.
Well, I don't know. There are a number. Yeah, it is related to free speech. And it is related to cancel culture. And those two things are connected with each other, although they have an independent aspect. The identitarian, this is the age of identitarianism. I mean, you could almost call it. I mean, it's a major. You're the intellectual historian, but it does seem to me something quite characteristic of our time.
And I think because it relates to sort of the neoliberal individualist terms. So in that larger political economic structure, the individual becomes a focus of politics. This was the conservative critique of the New Deal, but now it's transmogrified because in that language of individualism, this is the type of politics that it promotes ultimately. So it's not disconnected from the larger political economic structure, in my opinion. This is the irony, I think, of the conservative critique of identitarian politics, is that this is what people were arguing in the 70s and the 80s. You need to organize politics more around the individual and less around the group. And this is ultimately an outcome of that. Not the only outcome, but an outcome of that.
Okay, I'm going to try to answer. I'm thinking here. It's bad for the soul. I'll defend that. I'll say what I mean by that, and I'll defend that. It's bad for the soul. It threatens civilization, and I'll say what I mean. I'll say what I mean about that. Bad for the soul. I am not my race. I'm not this. to have the historical accident of identity define me is spiritually, and I, this is not a scientific claim I'm making here, and people will take strong issue with it. Spiritually stultifying. It surrenders way too much. I mean, we are the authors of our of our being. We are yet to be completed. There's so much to learn. There's so many places to go. There's so much to do. Of course, I'm a college professor, so I think of this in terms of kids coming in at 18 years old and they want to Afro studies and they want to be whatever they are. They want to be these things. I'm saying, man, you haven't read a damn book yet. Hey, you haven't listened to an opera yet. You haven't seen kabuki theater yet. You have, you know, you haven't done anything. I understand that you come packaged a certain way. I know that you have sexualities and ethnicities and religiosities, but for crying out loud, the challenge here is to take these things, the external givens, which are the raw material, and to construct a life. And that project, that constructive project of starting somewhere and then being in the world is a universal human challenge. The reason that I can read Pasternak or Tolstoy or somebody and learn something about my life is because they are also facing that challenge. I mean, the narrowness, the solipsism, the reductive kind of sophomoric, it's too small. This is too small of a way to live. You are missing it if you live like this. So it's bad for the soul. It endangers civilization. They tell me that it's a dead white male and I shouldn't read the book. You know, it's Plato and Aristotle and, you know, Aquinas and Augustine. Thank you.
No,
That's exactly what I was. Yeah, but okay. In any case, you know, or Maimonides, it could be Maimonides, okay? Don't read the book. It's a bunch of dead white men. I don't see anybody in the book who looks like me. Now, I've already done the soul part. That's a stupid thing to say. I don't see anybody in the book who looks like me. You don't even know what you look like. You look in the mirror and you think you know who you are. So I don't see anybody in the book who looks like me. But they are threatening the integrity of these precious institutions. When you shut down somebody from speaking because they made the native descendants of the native population of the North American continent feel bad by what they had to say about Columbus. Because they wanted to defend stop and frisk as a way of managing crime in a city. Because they think that rape culture is an inaccurate characterization of gender dynamics in a certain population, in a certain whatever. When you tell a scribbler who wants to examine as a scientific proposition the genetic predeterminants, if any, of intellectual performance, and you don't let the lecture happen, when you assault the teaching of the classics of the Western tradition as oppressive colonialization, etc., when you turn these places into propaganda mills, When it all comes to be about virtue signaling and banner waving at the university, you're throwing away something here. So the iconoclasm on behalf of identity, and I'm not just talking about statues, I'm talking about books. The iconoclasm, I'm talking about ideas, I'm talking about disciplines, I'm talking about intellectual inheritance. How is it that we know what it is that we know about the origins of the universe? What is the intellectual pedigree of human civilization's comprehension of the origins of the universe? What's the pedigree? What is it? What foundation does it stand on? About the origins of the species. The demystification of the age of faith by the age of reason happened at a particular time and in a particular place. You want to smash that one too? The identitarians run amok, threaten to destroy the university. So that's why I think it's a bad way of living, and I think these people are dangerous.
So I've got a couple of quick responses. That was really interesting. I mean, I agree with a lot of what you said, but of course, the famous Marx quote, right? Men make their own history, but do they not make it as they please, right? There still are structures. And even if these things don't define you, one still enters history at a moment of accretions of various ideological and institutional elements, which I also think is important to take into account, even though I do agree with you ultimately about sort of this universalistic element to humans being in dynamic. But one thing that I really want to ask about is because I've been listening to you just frankly for years, and I think talking famously about the Ray Kelly shutdown at Brown years ago, all those things. So my question, I mean, I do empathize and sympathize with your point to a certain degree, but as a historian, oftentimes a lot of these taboos get worked out in messy ways, right? So what is a protest if not the expression of the democratic will of admittedly students who haven't read everything, who don't know anything, who are working their stuff out? But is that not a legitimate expression of the democratic will as a society begins to reshape various cultural norms and taboos over time? So like, how does one navigate the dialectic between universities as spaces of free inquiry, but universities are and never have been totally utopian spaces of free inquiry? Some things are allowed, some things are not allowed. And the expression of a democratic will in protest against particular ideas that particular constituencies view as illegitimate. Is it just that the authority, the administrative structure says, no, we decide, sorry, collection of people, you're wrong? Or is that collection of people need to be taken seriously because that is what democracy ultimately is? That is the will of the people expressing itself in a form of popular protest.
Okay, I hear you. My answer is going to be stark. The university is not a democracy. It really is a hierarchical institution and enterprise. And that's what disciplines mean. I don't try to tell the physics department who they're going to give tenure to or what research is worth going on because they know better than I do, et cetera. And it's the tail wagging the dog, intellectually speaking, if the demos is setting the curriculum. But that's too stark and it's impractical. So I don't want to cede the normative claim for democracy, but I will cede a pragmatic observation to the extent that it would be deeply unwise to ignore the sentiments that are being expressed through mobilization and protest, because after all, the viability of the enterprise requires the cooperative engagement of all parties concerned. That goes at many levels. Within a family, parents are presumably the responsible agents, but you can't just tell the kid what to do. You have to kind of mold a relationship that allows for an influence. It'll be much more direct at the early stage of development, and it'll be much more cooperative and accommodating as things go along. And a point will be reached where the parent's authority will be very, very different than what it had been. It's an analogy, but I mean something like that in this case. That's about things like the curriculum or whatever. But procedural things like who gets on the faculty, like how is the work of the university conducted, like what are the requirements of members and to participate in the enterprise, such as to acknowledge and respect the rights of others in the enterprise. Um, I think it's the responsibility of leadership to affirm those things and to stand by those things. Um, Again, wisely. So there can be good and bad leadership. There can be ham-handed leadership, and there can be wise and subtle leadership. But still, the goal should be um, not responding to the demos because the will of the people. That this is not a democracy. This is a structured hierarchy of knowledge production and inquiry and so on that has, not everybody gets to put the book on the shelf in the library. The book is on the shelf in the library is curated. Not everybody gets to publish in the journal. The editors of the journal are gatekeepers for a reason, etc.
So then this is my question. How do you relate this to the fact that the university has essentially become such a space of consumption? I was looking at Penn the other day. Penn costs $80,000 a year. I mean, so I was just thinking, I would love to hear your reflections on, like, Harvard cost $4,000 in 1984, now costs 80. So to me, this is intention. If you treat students as customers, they're going to act like customers. And to me, this is part of a fact that has delegitimized that hierarchical a structure of authority, because the students, especially at very elite spaces, I went to Columbia, you teach at Brown, these students are viewed as future donors. So I was wondering how you view that as informing the shape of the university as a large structure, because last time, I think, the adjunctification we talked about last time is part and parcel of this. So I'm just wondering, from your seat at the university, how you take this enormous transformation, good dining halls, great dorms, rock climbing walls, parents weekend, you have parents emailing professors. So how does that relate to this whole thing? Because to me, they seem profoundly connected, and you can't have this sort of neoliberal university and not expect students to behave as their customers.
You're going to like this because I'm teaching a course on free inquiry and open expression. Where we're reading the classics, and we read Plato, and we read Milton, and we read John Stuart Mill, and we're in the 20th century now. And our last class was on Václav Havel's essay, The Power of the Powerless. So this is a very profound contribution to political literature in the 20th century. Everybody should read this. And I'm not going to try to summarize what's in this book, okay, except to say that he's describing the situation of the dissident in Soviet-dominated Central Europe. He's in Czechoslovakia. Prague Spring came and it went. Okay, the tanks remained. And we're in the late 1970s. And what's going to culminate in 1989 is already afoot. Lech Walesa in Poland, Solzhenitsyn in Russia. There are things that are happening. And it's breathtaking intellectually to look back on this moment. But anyway, I could go on about this for a long time. Here's what I'm trying to say. He describes the totalitarian totalism, the autototalitism, I think, or some kind of word like that he uses, of everybody living within the lie, everybody knowing that the system is corrupt and bankrupt, but nobody wanting to speak out. The emperor has no clothes. He describes that. And he analyzes it down to a T, man, the greengrocer, the greengrocer. He analyzes it down to a T. Why does he put the sign in the window, workers of the world unite, when he knows it's bullshit? And the lady who comes and buys her carrots and her tomatoes, she doesn't even look at the sign, etc. Why everybody is cooperating in this fraud, in this phony thing. It's a house of cards. It's an elaborate structure of mutual lying to each other. And we're afraid, we're all fearful. There's fear all the way down. Okay. And because we're afraid. It's because we're concerned about self. It's because somebody's going to hurt us. Somebody's going to hurt us. When in fact, the human spirit cries out for truth. Okay, this is Havel. This is not me. This is Havel, but you must read this book, people. So he then says, you got to read the whole thing. You can't just read the part where he describes communism. You got to go to the part where he says, maybe we have become infected by the superficial, materialistic consumer values of the West. Maybe the difference between the East and the West is not as great as you think it is because we're all selling our souls. We sell our souls in order not to be bothered by the state police. They sell their souls in order to have a fancier car or a bigger house or whatever. And my students and I, encountering this thing, and having just read Mill, who's a utilitarian, and here we get to this guy who's practically making a kind of moral statement. I mean, he's saying that the worth of life is not to be calculated in terms of how good it makes you feel. It's to be calculated in terms of how true you are to your being. It's almost a religious argument that he's making. There's something within us that cries out for truth, and how dare we extirpate it? How dare we tamp it down just to live comfortably? So anyway, that's what I think about that. I mean, in other words, I think you're right. Or you're right to say that the logic of feel-good consumerism and the logic of the market as institutions compete for the size of the pie and everybody, and the logic of the administrators who run the institutions who have career concerns of their own, and the logic of the kids who arrogate to themselves some presumption of elitism or whatnot because they got in. I'm in and you're out. I'm in and you're out. And the pampered character of the whole experience, because nobody, if I go on like this, I won't be able to teach my class tomorrow. They have so many assumptions. Nobody's supposed to get anything less than a B.
And a B is bad.
It's very bad. It's very bad.
Yeah.
Where do you get off? Where do you get off assuming that you can't just be average? You think everybody's an A student? Well, of course everybody's not an A student. And the more rarefied the assembly, the more obvious it is that not everybody's an A student. Or can I have another 2 days to write this paper? Or accommodations with respect, okay? But, gaming the system, there's just a lot of gaming the system that's going on, which I think betrays a kind of facile, self-aggrandizing, it's the opposite of the intellectual challenge. And so to conclude that what has happened, and it certainly has happened, these places have become very different than they were a half century ago. The proliferation of these administrators for one or another aspect of student this or of student that. And as you say, a lot of money is going into building dormitories and swimming pools and, et cetera, et cetera. And I'm sure there's an elaborate plan about what goes in the dining hall and things of all this kind. And it's all catering to a certain kind of sensibility. And you're right about the parents' weekends and so forth. It's a big deal. It's a big deal around here. And when I see the families walking, the prospective families proudly, I don't want to, make fun of anybody because after all, they do pay the bills around here. But their climbing acquisitiveness almost, it oozes out of their pores. They want in so badly, So the idea that kind of utilitarian quest for personal satisfaction and consumption might be indirectly and directly corrupting the intellectual enterprise, I find that to be quite plausible.
Yeah, I just don't see from a practical level how universities can be spaces of consumption and then demand the type of authority that that you're implying that they have. That's a fundamental tension. And I think in America of 2021, the consumption is going to win. That's the larger culture that we exist in. And I just wanted to highlight that tension and sort of building off of
But
that.
wait a minute, before you do that, I want to reiterate what you just said. I think you said something that's really very important. I want the university to be an intellectual hierarchy in which the adults run the show because it's about ideas. They run it respectfully and with consideration, but they nevertheless run it. You're saying that battle is lost a long time ago when you decided to go commercial. And the logic of your commercial move means that you surrendered the authority to be able to write the script. And if you're right, we're fucked.
Yeah, and I would say, I mean, universities are just synecdoche of larger American culture. The turn to consumer capitalism in the 1960s is an enormous epochal shift in how people relate to the state, you know, where your primary identity, I'd say in the United States of 2021, if we're being identitarian about it, your primary identity is consumer. Why are Amazon workers essential? Because they allow you to consume. I mean, I think this is something profoundly problematic about American culture that we haven't even begun to really address. And I think you see it in the university. That's the only point I wanted to get out.
Okay.
And so building off of that, we have to talk about cancel culture. Particularly, what do you think cancel culture is? And what do you think the problem is? Because I would say this is a term that is so capacious that it refers to universities retaliating against political speech to, again, the demos protesting Ray Kelly. So I was just wondering what you, or the student demo. So what is your view of cancel culture and why do you think it's so problematic based on that view? What do you find so problematic?
Well, it's not just the universities, of course. I mean, you know, people are losing their jobs or their platforms all over the place for running afoul of one thing or another, for offending, for giving someone cause to call them misogynistic or homophobic or racist. You know, this N-word thing that has arisen in the news recently with one incident or another of someone using the word or defending the use of the word and getting canceled. The Me Too movement and the reprimand of people for sexual transgressions from the past that leaves them unfit then to be the public face of this or that. Tweets, people retweeting, you retweeted something, you must be a QAnon advocate or whatever. And then the person becomes, you know, an inappropriate host of a TV show, or you say something in class. I have said this in my class. In the 21st century, African Americans on the whole have failed to measure up to the challenge which was opened before them by the liberalizations associated with the civil rights movement and the end of Jim Crow. I have said that. I could try to defend it here, but that would take us off the beaten path. My point is, a white professor can't say that. Literally. A white professor cannot say in a classroom in America that Black people have failed. If he does, he'll be a white supremacist and he'll be finished, or she. And you ask me, what problem do I find with this? It's anti-intellectual in the extreme. It's witch huntery. It's mob justice. It's mass hysteria in the extreme. Now, there's a spectrum. There's going to be a range of cases that we could present. And yes, there does exist an offense so offensive that even I would cancel the offender. But saying the N-word is not one of them, frankly. Certainly not in the context in which Donald McNeil was dismissed from the New York Times for what he did. And I don't want to get into the particulars of the anecdotes. I just want to say, what am I defending the use of the N-word or whatever? It's what did you're a Marxist. Don't you all have a word for this kind of thing where it's like a trivial, what did Proudhon do that was wrong? What their property is theft. Doesn't Marx have an essay where he refutes the triviality, the intellectual triviality of the claim property is theft, or something like that? Something like that. It's petty. It's small think morality. It's small think racial justice. It's etiquette. Now, I know Orwell has got something in Politics in the English Language or somewhere about the thing that I'm talking about now, which is that people are policing certain aspects of performative social presentation instead of making arguments about political economy, arguments about ethics and morality, arguments about aesthetics, arguments about political theory. They're not making arguments. They presuppose that the arguments have already been made and resolved in favor of whatever fluff fills their heads. And then they think they can go around and cut people's heads off because they don't affirm their nostrums. So I maybe at this level of abstraction, it's hard to say. But on the race thing, a person had a photograph from 1982 when they graduated from high school in which they wore blackface. And now it comes out because somebody looks at the yearbook and they decide that they're going to run an expose in the Washington Post about this person. I don't see how they survive it, And I think it's, like I say, petty. It's a small bore. First of all, I know almost nothing about whether or not the person is actually a racist from the fact that I've stipulated. Whatever we mean by the person being a racist. What I mean is I know almost nothing about whether or not the person has values and beliefs relevant to his current behavior that are indicative of some kind of racial antipathy or malice that should cause me to want that person not to serve in public. I don't know anything about it. You're trying to have an argument with lower middle class Alabama culture in the early 1980s. Yeah, they all voted for Ronald Reagan. Yeah, they all liked Jerry Falwell. Yeah, they were all mostly racists who thought that the civil rights movement was bullshit. A lot of them were. So the politics of 2020 becomes about whether or not somebody who had a blackface on in 1982 can. You don't see that that's I'm not you personally. Don't you guys see that that's a triviality? What it is it's a kind of power move. We get to flex our muscles because we control who can speak.
So this is what I think is crucial. And because you mentioned power, I think many, if not most people would agree on the excesses. But to me, cancel culture strikes as such a weapon of the weak, to quote James Scott. Right? There are people who feel that there's not normal channels through which to affect decisions about basically the elite that controls society. And that's not incorrect. We are a society that's been organized to give certain groups enormous amounts of power, totally disconnected from the democratic will. So cancel culture is this explosion of anger by people who don't have any other mechanism by which to express that anger, who don't even feel the need to engage in argument because they feel that they would lose the argument either initially or because that they won't be taken seriously. And it's another reflection, and I think a lot of the things that we've been talking about, of a delegitimation of American elite institutions and American elite culture. And I think it's that, what to focus on. I mean, we could all rail against the excesses of cancel culture, but it's that there's a reason that these things are no longer legitimate. And that reason, and that's a rational response to the history of the past 30 years. Is that not?
Uh, you are impressing me, Daniel, really, because these are things that I hadn't quite thought about, and it sounds to me like you've got your finger on something, and it has really powerful implications because you're right. Even I could feel a little hollow sometimes complaining about cancel culture just to be complaining, because you know uh, I don't really know what I'm. I am in a way being petulant myself. I mean, it's an imposition upon me. It's stupid. But I don't have any analysis, and you just offer something to think about. Uh, and it would mean, if you're right, that even though you still might not want to let them have their way, if you can stop them, uh, you might think a little bit differently about it. And this is not a policy prescription. What do you do to empower people so that they needn't use flailing out petty means of asserting themselves, of feeling that they have some control over the political culture, when in fact big money in politics or corporate advertising or whatever is really running the show. Um, well, then they're gonna do these kind of things. They're gonna set bonfires or leave the fire hydrant running and flood the street. Or
Do you know what it reminds me of? It reminds me of like Mexico in the 1960s, where the only way to attack one party rule is to basically do what were called denunciations, right? Which is the exact same thing as cancel culture, right? There's no space, there's no political mechanism. So the only thing you could do is basically explode in a paroxysm of anger. And it's not a surprise with a lot of particularly the elite media cancel culture. 2 weeks, 3 weeks later, you find out that, oh, actually everyone hated this person and they weren't retiring or they weren't pushed out. And so this was the weapon that basically people used, the powerful weapon of the moment, to basically force something through which they had no other mechanism, right? How many times have you heard someone who was canceled? And I agree it's a real thing, and I agree there's lots of excesses, but very rarely do you, oh, that guy was actually a great guy who took everyone seriously and really responded to people's demands and they interacted in a nice way. And oh no, they made this one misstep and they were canceled. I can't think of one. And that there's a reason for that, because this is basically a circumvention of a system that has collapsed, in my opinion, the system that is no longer viewed as legitimate. Does that make sense?
It's something I want to think about. I don't know if I want to sign on entirely, but yeah, it certainly makes sense. Uh, what I'm not signing on to is that every victim of cancel culture is an asshole that had it coming, which is kind of what you just said.
No, that's not true. I think in particular elite spaces with people who are like in elite jobs that wind up getting pushed out, that's a lot of the things that are happening. But I think you mentioned Hirschman recently. If you can't exit and you don't have loyalty, all you have is voice. And cancel culture is a reflection, maybe not the ideal reflection, but it's an expression of voice, is it not?
Well, it certainly is, and that's certainly a way of looking at it. And it, like I said, it gives me something to think about. So,
because I agree with you. There's clear excesses, of course, but to me they reflect the social problem, and it's the social problem, some might say the base, that's more interesting to me than the superstructural reflection of it, which is what I think cancel culture ultimately is in the final analysis.
I want to know who these people are, and I want to know exactly what's going on. I mean, there are many examples, but some of these are very privileged people who are launching the crusades against. I mean, if I'm in a newsroom, and I've got a goodly number of journalists of color who are part of the organization, but they're younger and they don't have major positions of power in the organization. And I've got a 35 or 40-year veteran who's a kind of centrist Democrat, madman era misogynist type, He didn't actually do anything, but he's a certain type. And he doesn't like affirmative action. He's probably said something to somebody that made them think that he didn't respect them. He might even vote for Trump, God help us. We don't know. He lies and says he doesn't, but he just might. He could. We could see him doing it. That's a prototypic setting, it seems to me, in which if he says the N-word, we get him at the jugular. And it's true. The editors had his back. The publisher had his back. They were buddies. They drank together at the club. They came up in the same prep school. It's true. They don't know diddly about, I don't know what, graffiti artists or, Black Lives Matter or queer literature or whatever. They don't know anything about anything. And therefore, we are voiceless. That is, those of us who are in that young generation, who are of color, who are queer, who are didn't go to the prep school. So now, once he's out there and exposed, we go for the jugular. Your story would have me read that through your Marxian class analysis, and it would be just a hierarchical situation. I see it, that little anecdote that I'm telling, as symptomatic or emblematic of many of these situations. I see it as much more complicated and much more interesting, because it's not just who owns the means of production that determines who has the power. In fact, obviously, the people who have the ability to cancel have some kind of power, depending on the institution. It can be the students determining what's on the syllabus, because, they are post-colonial. And the guy that wants to put, the memoirs of a British Raj administrator from the late 19th century, because it's interesting as a historical document, on the reading list, hasn't got a leg to stand on. Anyway, basically, yeah, I hear what you're saying, Daniel, and you're probably more right than wrong, but I don't want to completely concede the kind of class-based, kind of economic class-based analysis of the thing, because I think the cultural power is more nuanced and subtle than that.
Sure, cultural power is a real thing, absolutely. But I mean, the fact is, millennials own 2.1% of national wealth, and boomers owned 23% of national wealth at the same age. There's a general feeling of precarity.
I didn't know that. That's a stunning number. That's an unbelievable number.
That might be it might not be 2, it might be 3, but it's something ridiculous.
Wow. But you're saying boomers, when they were the same age as millennials are now, were on the upswing of the post-World War II bonanza. Exactly. And I'm one of those people, and my 401k is looking pretty good right now.
My point is that it's a weapons of the weak thing by a generation that has been, one, I think really crucial, promised a lot growing up in the 90s and 2000s and didn't get it. And that is the perfect situation for these sorts of phenomena to emerge. I mean, it's the exact situation. So I just wanted to emphasize that I think there's this serious thing happening that underlays a lot of these phenomena.
Excuse me, I just have to look at my calendar to make sure that I didn't double book, and I did not. Thank goodness.
No problem. But I just think, it's interesting because I feel like the cancel culture discourse occurs totally at the level of discourse. And then there's this fundamental change in how an entire generation relates to the political economy and the institutions of their country that is just never talked about. And why is everyone all of a sudden so angry?
That's pretty profound. Actually, I mean, your contribution to the conversation we're having here, I think, deserves to be somehow pulled together and summarized as a nuanced cultural, critical cultural analysis. Have you done that anywhere?
No, I haven't yet. I haven't.
Okay. Well, I encourage you.
But I think it's a thing missing from this entire discourse that, to me, this is an enormous causal element of all this stuff.
Okay.
So I've got some more time if you do.
Yeah. We could take a few more minutes. I got a 2 o'clock that I need to prepare for. It's almost 1:30 now.
Yeah, and I'm actually presenting a paper at 2, so I should probably have 10 minutes of break. But one thing, okay, so I know you've declaimed your Trumpian, not support, but your Trumpian rhetoric. I'm wondering,
Yeah.
it's probably a bit hard now because there's been so much discourse, but what was your initial reflection to Trump? Now that he's become more historical, at least at the current moment, maybe he'll run in 2024, who knows? But what was your initial reflection to Trump, and particularly, how did you feel? Because I feel like that was maybe your final break with like the center left.
Yeah.
And how narrate that sort of final break?
Yeah. So, I mean, I'm going to declare, I was never actually a Trump supporter, but I have been called a Trump apologist because I would see the other side and I would say things in defense of Trump. But that said, I think I should answer you straight. So you've heard of Brexit.
I've heard of it.
There were the leave and there were the remain. Okay. A lot of people who really knew better supported leave. Knew better from the point of view of what's the long view here about European nationalism and whatnot, or knew better just from an even more practical point of view. What's the immediate economic and financial, whatever? They kind of knew that leave was wrong, but they still, okay. And I'm kind of like that guy here. You couldn't miss that Trump was a hustler. You couldn't miss that he was a certain kind of P.T. Barnum. There was something, and when people would make that argument to me, I could not refute the argument. On the other hand, for I think similar reasons to why many respectable Brits had more sympathy for leave than perhaps their wisdom would have allowed. He was poking the bear right where I wanted it poked. So, for example, he says, America first, Europe needs to pay its own way. I'm tired of these countries free riding on us. Well, I'll be honest with you, and I'm not an expert, you are, on international affairs, the study thereof.
He's right about that.
But I thought he might be, okay?
Yeah.
I thought the post-World War II, Dulles Brothers kind of, imaginings about, or even Bush, father, son, imaginings about what respectable Americans need to do on behalf of the world. The fuck? That's not the world in 1945. The Cold War's been over for a very long time. This is the world of the Chinese. Have you checked out what's going on? So they're so smug. They're so smug with their Ivy League degrees and their Council of Foreign Relations conferences. And I'm a member of the Council of Foreign Relations.
I interned there.
But you get what I'm saying, okay? That's just one example. You and I may not agree about this. He says you don't have a country if you don't have a border. Let me just stipulate, I'm not a racist. I'm not a racist. I'll say it again. The idea that as an American and as an African American, I could take an interest in what the flows are into the population of which I'm a citizen and a resident on behalf of how I understand my own personal, my communal, and my national best interest, and then adjudicate it. It doesn't mean no refugees. It just means I put the thing on the table and I try to figure out what I'm doing because I want to decide that. I don't want that to happen willy-nilly by forces out of my control. Now, that may be wrong, but it's not crazy and it's not racist. And there's just a lot of stuff like, I'm not even talking about the cultural stuff, about the, political correctness and all of that kind of stuff. There were just a lot of things that were like that. I thought climate, here again, this is in some ways not dissimilar to the first point. I thought it's a hard problem, not an easy problem. Not that Trump understands the problem. That, it's about burden sharing amongst nations, and there's a kind of game that goes on about who's going to do what. It's about managing a technological / political / economic intergenerational long-term dynamic problem where there's a lot of uncertainty. There's uncertainty about future technology. There's just a lot that we don't know. I'm not a denier. I have to say I'm not a racist and I'm not a denier. I'm just saying it's a hard problem, okay? When I feel myself being stampeded into profound structural interventions on behalf of a sentiment which isn't grounded in an assessment. I know this is not Trump, this is Glenn Loury. He's not smart enough to give the speech I'm giving right now. I stipulate that. But he seemed to be making more space for some kind of thing. And I'll say this, and I will get my head handed to me for it. Early in the days of COVID, when he was acting a buffoon and where in retrospect we can see he did grave damage to the country, I still felt something positive about the oppositional character to me being stampeded and feeling that I was being stampeded by people who labored under a tyranny of metrics and under an illusion of control and who wanted to prescribe every detail of my life. So when I felt some pushback against that, I say it with trepidation because I know in retrospect, he erred grievously with respect to the management of this problem. I do not dispute that in the least. You asked me what some of my feelings were, and I'm telling you, the primary feeling was of the zeitgeist, whether it be about international relations or it be about climate or be about the border or be about whatever, trying to dictate to me from their posture of elite, know-it-all, arrogant, supercilious haughtiness, what was right in the world. And the fact that there was somebody who was saying something different from that made me want to at least listen and give a benefit of a doubt. The Black districts of the cities of the country are terrible places. They have been failed by many institutions, not just the Democrats who represent those districts in Congress. There needed to be, he says, what do you have to lose? This is where I started. This is the point of Trump during the campaign of 2016, when he said, this is something I care very much about, African-American politics and social economy. And he says, what do you have to lose? And I thought, I'm not voting for this joker, but is he actually getting ready to effectively pose in American politics a question about the rationality of African-American monolithic support for Democrats and so forth? Is a space gonna open up here? Now, he did nothing with that. He put Ben Carson in charge of housing and urban development, who went to sleep there. A couple of $100 billion, serious money, but also, as we know, in the era of COVID relief, not all that serious money if you really are determined to spend it, aimed at a demonstration of a different kind of way of getting our hands around these issues. Now, he's not capable of pulling it off. I understand that. I'm not saying he is. I'm just saying the cast of mind that I was in was, is this an opportunity for something significant to happen in this debate? And so that's why I gave him a lot more space in my head and a lot more leeway than the next guy, because I really wanted things shaken up.
Glenn, I have a question. Do you see a relationship between you using Trump as sort of an end run around the politics about things that you felt you can't talk about and what's going on with cancel culture? About an end run? It's like Trump is a similar paroxysm of rage against a system that you don't feel responds or provides space for debate and discourse. Is it not the same thing? And what I'm really getting at is, does this not reflect a broader cross-political spectrum belief that the system is illegitimate? different spaces, but there's a fundamental
Yeah.
delegitimation going on right now, and
I,
that yours is Trump, and there's cancel culture, and there are end runs around the system, essentially a system that people
and
view as
note well that these end runs are political dead ends.
well. I think they've proven to be
And I
because
can see why a
Biden
systemic
won.
a, I can see why how a systematic account such as a sophisticated Marxian framework would afford you could be an extremely attractive alternative to the political dead ends that are keeping butting our heads against the brick wall of illegitimate and dysfunctional and atrophied institutions that mainly only serving the interest of the well-heeled and the well-connected. I can see why a systematic account of history might be very appealing, but to have myself likened to the cancel culture devotees, it hurts, Daniel. It hurts.
Well, we're all products of the age, right? And I think there's a reason that socialism is back, because the structural analysis is a very powerful thing at this particular moment. And I want to add, it's not just political economy; it's also constitutions. The Senate. The founders did not think Wyoming would have 500,000 people and California would have 45 million.
No, they didn't.
These are really, really problematic things. The founders did not predict that our country would essentially be a series of heavily populated cities and very sparsely populated rural areas.
No, they didn't. I agree.
So these are really fundamental structural issues, which is why I think structural analysis is back. But what I find disconcerting is that the well-heeled have just won again with Biden. And I don't think Biden's going to do anything. And I think we're going to be in a holding pattern in a very profoundly consequential decade, and I'm very, very pessimistic about the future, personally.
Well, I'm sorry to hear you say that, except for one reason. My lovely wife, Lawan, who was a Bernie Sanders supporter, will listen to this entire conversation just to hear your last sentence. That corporate Democrat Biden is not the answer. He's part of the problem.
And I was going to...
Because she's been saying that for the last year.
I just wanted to end on that. What's your take on Biden? What's your take on sort of the ancien regime reasserting itself, beating Bernie, beating Trump, beating the sort of populist end-run challengers? I'm just curious, what's your take on that?
It is depressing, to be honest with you. And I am not hardened by it in the least. And what I've heard coming in areas that I'm concerned about out of the administration has not made me happy. And I'm more conservative than you are, so it's not necessarily that we would agree on the same policies, but you're putting it that way. The ancien regime reasserting itself, that's exactly what has happened. I mean, we could go back to the presidency of Barack Obama. I'm on the record saying that he messed up when he didn't lock the bankers up or zero them out so that they left the table with no chips whatsoever. Even if it would have been bad policy, as I said, I think to you, it would have been very good politics and an opportunity was missed. You could say that. And I certainly don't think that you're going to get anything. I mean, Biden is not exactly the most dynamic, visionary, and inspiring person. With respect to the president, he's up in years and he has never been a particularly dynamic or inspiring person. If you ask me what's his vision, I could tell you what Trump's vision is much more clearly than I could tell you what Biden's vision is. I just did. I ticked off 4 or 5 things. I mean, do that for Biden. I don't know what they are. The committee hasn't met yet to hand him the memo. So it's obviously a transitional situation. I don't know that Biden will run for re-election. I don't know that Kamala Harris will be a compelling leader of the country 2 or 3 or 4 years from now. So we're going to see what's going to happen. There's going to be a lot of jockeying for position. And after all, the Republicans have a problem of reconstituting themselves, I suppose. And I don't know what's going to happen to Donald Trump. Something tells me that he's not going away. So it's going to be, get the popcorn. It's going to be very interesting to watch the political developments of the next couple of years. Yeah,
the way that I think about it is that this is the first time in my lifetime that it's it's a plastic moment in a real way. There's a bunch of different paths, and this country could go in a different one, much more so than the end of the Cold War. So it's in some sense we're living in truly interesting times. But I feel like we might go and choose the wrong path.
I think that's a good note to end on, Daniel. We are indeed living in truly interesting times. And for me, meeting you has been one interesting experience. I'm very grateful. Let's stay in touch.
Absolutely, Glenn. It's been a real genuine pleasure. I appreciate it so much.